Hey, and welcome back to the Transection podcast. This is season 2, and we're very pleased to be bringing you lots of really awesome interviews and loads of really cool episodes. A big thank you to all of our guests and everyone who took part in season 1 and all of our amazing listeners. We wouldn't do this if it weren't for you. And a big thank you to all of our guests. And season 1 was really, really amazing. It came to a natural end. And we were really, really proud of it. Lots of hard work went into that, and it was just so enjoyable. Season 2 is even bigger and better. We've got lots of really amazing people that we've had some incredible conversations with. So we really hope that you're going to enjoy it. This episode, I talked to Rose Ethington, who is a trans non-binary woman. She's also just starting her PhD, which looks at the intersection of race and class within trans and non-binary issues, which is really fascinating. But Rose has a background of lots of different subjects, learning statistics. What was it? Statistics, sociology, and I want to say it's something about animals. She'll explain it way better than I do. In fact, she does in this episode. And it's fascinating what we talk about. She called me out in it for using a poo theme in my analogies more than once. So I apologise. That was not my intention, but I have been hanging out with a 1-year-old all day, so that may have influenced my thinking, although knowing me, it might have absolutely nothing to do with it, and I just might be a very childish person. So anyway, enjoy. And if you haven't done so already, sign up to our mailing list at muxharrishill.com/transection. There's a green box. You just put your name and your email in there, and it's simple. It's done. It will take you like 2 seconds. And that way, whenever we've got a new episode out, or we're doing any kind of promotions, or we want to tell you about something, then we'll email you. But I promise you, it's not very much at all. So sign up for that. If you haven't followed us yet on social media, we're on Facebook at the Transection Podcast. We're on Twitter at TransectionP and Instagram at Transection Podcast. Enjoy. Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Transection Podcast, where I'm joined by Rose Ethington from, whereabouts are you from, Rose?
At the moment, I am in Utah in the United States.
Woo, Utah. No, lots of nice people from Utah. You're one of them. So thanks, Rose, for coming on this episode. We're going to talk about a few different things. Rose has got a bachelor's degree in... Remind me, do it again.
No problem. I did my undergraduate in wildlife biology, sociology, and statistics.
That's cool. So what was your sort of overall, was there a theme or a reason that you did those 3 things together, or was it just because you wanted to?
There's a lot of interesting parallels when you look at the 3. Statistics, if you're gonna be a scientist, it's gonna be needed no matter where you go. Sociology is kind of the study of individuals' relationships to society and society's societal forces. I can talk about my own field, I promise. But then wildlife biology and ecology, if you're going to talk about trans and non-binary issues, it helps, I think, to have a biology background. And I did work as a wildlife biologist for a while because, I can speak at least with some authority on biological issues. But then the ecology side of it, the relationship of animals to their environment is the exact same thing as sociology, just on a different scale. So it kind of at least all ties together in my head.
Yeah, that makes sense. I get it. And you're just starting your PhD, and just tell everyone what you're doing for your PhD.
Sure. Yeah, I just started my PhD, which, in the middle of a global pandemic has been interesting to say the least. But it is in sociology, and my area of research is transgender and non-binary populations, how both institutional barriers and social structural forces, and then individual needs shifts for different trans and non-binary identities with race and class.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
cool. So just give us a few examples, Rose, about the different examples of how trans and non-binary issues might affect different types of people.
Yeah, it's sad because, there hasn't been a whole lot of work that has been done on trans and non-binary populations, going back in sociology. Any mentions tended to be pretty negative, not exactly positive frameworks used. That has started to change in the last 10 years as there has been more work done, but researchers tend to look at trans and non-binary people as a homogenous group. Okay, what do trans and non-binary people experience? Where I'm coming from is that, look, homogenized statistics or views of our identities really don't give you a complete picture whatsoever. The experience of what a white binary trans man who is wealthy experiences in his life is going to be far different from what a white, poor, non binary woman is going to face in her life or their life, which is going to be different from what a black trans woman faces, which is going to be different from what a trans femme immigrant is going to face. These are very different experiences and what type of discrimination they're going to face, what institutional barriers to meeting their needs they're going to face, but also then on an interpersonal level, um, likelihood of experiencing violence and other things. These are different. So we have to take a more comprehensive and kind of heterogeneous approach to the work.
Yeah, for sure. And what is your hope? What do you hope to um, if more people start to take this view that you're taking and start to give a more kind of nuanced kind of support to people depending on all of these different intersecting parts of their identity or their situation. What do you hope will be the outcome of that attitude?
Yeah. You know, I mean, changing individuals' opinions of the community is important, but I don't think you can start there, because there's only so many people you can reach at a time. And I think a lot of those opinions and attitudes or stigmas or stereotypes that individuals have come from institutional structures. So my hope is that if I can get, more institutional entities, whether that's universities, governments, etc., to start creating more access for people and recognizing the variation in human experience, then we can lessen some of those effects on that level and then have that work downward to the individual level.
Mm.
So, for
Uh,
example, if you think of like a university campus, um, housing on university campuses is, notoriously discriminatory, both on the basis of race, just through, racist pressures, but then also on gender, period. But then through, when you add in trans and non-binary identities, it gets even more complicated. So if we can actually show that there are needs and, uh, you know, demonstrated ways to fix some of these problems, then maybe we can get those to change and then have it filter down from there.
yeah, that's cool.
Mhm.
Um, I wonder, yeah, I've often taken the attitude that, you know, the one of the best places that you can get to teach someone that sensitivity training is at work, because first of all, they're paid to be there. Second of all, it gets them away from their desk. And third of all, if they don't comply, there could be some kind of repercussion that they will care about.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I sometimes wonder if there's like that sort of subtle threat in the background is maybe not always the best motivator. So I wonder if in your sociology work you've come across any kind of positive outcomes that have come from a kind of positive motivation, or if a lot of the change that happens, do you think it needs to be a kind of like policy based thing first and that you hope eventually people will take it on in earnest?
I mean, I think it's a mix of both. For example, at one university, I actually developed a training for them um, for kind of an allies on campus kind of training. I hate the word allies, but you go with what you can. Um, the idea was that I could actually go in to work directly with faculty, with staff, and with students as well in like this 4-hour training where we can actually start diving into some of the different issues that the community is going to face. That program has been running, well, it was running even before I came along, but I helped revamp it, and I did a lot of the trainings for a year. And we did see some changes. We had like the gymnasium facilities on campus. We did a long training for some of their employees. And by the end of it, we had the employees actually talking about some of the issues like, hey, why is it that we only have, men and women's bathrooms? That seems difficult. And you actually have to go through those facilities to get to like the pool. So they were starting to raise with their supervisor, hey, we need to start adding in different restroom facilities, locker facilities. We need to actually kind of deconstruct how we're approaching this. Now, that's great on the individual level, and having the support of employees like that is critical, but then that has to reach the administration, which is more difficult to do. But the more you can do that, have the advocacy of the employees in that group, but then also be able to provide the background of the data to prove that, yes, this really is an issue, then hopefully we can start to get that changed.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And sometimes I see, like in a lot of kind of trans spaces, it attracts a lot of shitheads, and you
Definitely.
often see people like, but this is a non-issue, and I'm like, but how would you know? Even the way that this would be recorded doesn't exist.
That's right.
Where is it that this feedback or these effects can be accurately measured, when in the first place to even sign on to do a lot of feedback forms, there's no opportunity to correctly represent yourself.
That's right. And it puts all of the burden on trans and non-binary people themselves to try and get something changed, which really, is not a fair way to go about it. But that's kind of the idea of the, unmarked is a term we use in sociology a lot, where, the unmarked status tends to be the dominant power group. In this case, it would just be like the cisgender identity is unmarked. People don't notice the effects of a cisgender framework because it doesn't affect them, it benefits them. So understanding that there are other people who have a vastly different experience within the same system is what we have to kind of tease out, and then show how the effects of the unmarked policies and procedures and regulations that benefits it are actually supporting the domination to the detriment of the marked group. And I mean, that works the same. Whiteness is kind of worldwide the most unmarked category that we can talk about. Almost everything exists within a white Eurocentric framework, which has to start being addressed and deconstructed.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any data to give us a clue about why people in the dominant groups don't like to be labeled or marked?
I mean, yeah, there's a lot that's in there. To use a bit of an analogy just within race, which these are not direct comparisons, but just to use as an analogous situation. When we had the shift in the United States from the Jim Crow era into kind of the modern era around the 50s and 60s, we entered a period of colorblind ideology. This idea of, okay, we passed the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. Now everything's done. There are no racial equality issues in the United States. We don't talk about race, no matter what. Because if we do, that's going to make all the white people uncomfortable, and kind of the Western liberalism. And I don't mean that in the partisan sense of liberal. I mean that in the more broad, politically speaking, Western nations tend to be very liberal. And that liberalism wants to think that it has done everything that it needs to do, that everything has been successful, they've done all that they need. And so for somebody to bring up that there is still something fundamentally wrong with the system is going to challenge that for you personally. The idea that you are part of or reinforcing something that is hurting other people or giving you an unfair advantage is a difficult thing to reconcile yourself with. I think a lot of cisgender people, for example, they really don't want to hear, hey, what you're doing is not only hurting other people, whether you intend it to be or not, it is hurting other people. And you personally share responsibility in dismantling that. You are personally benefiting from this. It's very off-putting, this idea of, wait, I'm a good person. I shouldn't have to do anything. There's nothing wrong with me. How dare you say that I am privileged in some way because my life is still hard? And I get that. I mean, look, we live under under capitalism. Most people have a pretty difficult life unless you are part of, kind of the ruling capitalist class. And that's true. You do. You have difficulties and marginalizations that you are going through. But that isn't to say that you are not also benefiting from a system that privileges other parts of your identity, which is kind of the foundation of intersectionality. You're poor, yeah, you're going to go through a lot in your life. But what you are facing is not then compounded by the fact, by your race. It is not compounded by your gender identity. It is, but other people are going to have to deal with, being poor, but also then facing discrimination, harassment, systemic pressures based on their race because they're not white, based on their gender because they're not cis. So I think it's really difficult sometimes for people with more privileged identities to recognize that. But we have to. This is how we have to view the world. Nothing exists, in kind of a homogenous bubble.
Yeah, definitely. And you touched on something there that I see all the time in my own advocacy work, which is that people equate having a bias to being a bad person.
Yeah.
And I say it all the time. I'm like, no, wait. I'm like, listen, I'm part of the trans community. And when I was younger, I made a couple of transphobic jokes. I was unkind. I said those things. Sure. I wasn't a monster. I was just fucking ignorant. And, equally, when I was younger, I told racist jokes that at the time I didn't understand what I was doing. And again, I wasn't a monster. I just didn't know any better. And, those things don't make you a terrible person. It's, if you've grown up in an environment where all of that stuff is kind of, nobody really reacts to it very much, or they might even laugh with you for being so clever or so daring to think of something that they know is probably a bit below the belt, then they might even react kind of positively or kind of join in with you. And I think you know, we're all biased. And I listened to a guy, I can't remember his name. I think he's a professor of some kind, but he wrote Science and Spiritual Practices, and he was saying that there was some studies that said that it doesn't matter how much you train yourself to be kind of up to date with like what's, you know, politically correct, although I hate that term because it's just total bollocks. You either care or you don't. That's what I'm saying. But you know, he was saying you can work for years and years to end the suffering of other groups, and yet you can still test positive for having that bias in your mind.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for people to realize that having a bias is not, it doesn't make you evil, and it's also like to kind of expected, and that you should probably just acknowledge it and then just do your best and acknowledge that that kind of little flaw is still in your kind of programming, and just try not to take it too hard.
Yeah. And you raise an important point. You know, we have grown up in a white, cis, heterocentric reality. You know, it is just the fact that all white people are racist, all cis people are transphobic. That's just how the world is. But people need to understand what that actually means, because people, I think white people tend to think, you know, within, you know, the hegemony of colorblindness, that to be racist is the equivalent of being, you know, part of the KKK. Oh, you must be out, you know, on the street in a white hood shouting the N-word at people. That's what racism is. When in reality, it's like, well, sure, that's actually that's an extreme form of racism. You know, that's, you know, kind of segregationist racism. But then very well-meaning white people, we are still racist, just in a more assimilationist, colorblind kind of way. And that's not your fault. You were raised in that system. You were raised by parents who were also part of that system. And then the same thing on the trans side. It's like, look, being transphobic does not mean, yeah, you're out there trying to out trans people, you know, you're carrying around a bat. That is not the limitation of transphobia. So for people of privilege, you know, whatever that area of privilege is, whether that's your white privilege, whether that's your cis privilege, your class privilege, etc., need to understand that that is a part of what you were raised in and those internal biases that you carry. And so to proceed in an ethical manner requires constant effort to learn, re-educate, and change yourself to start trying to eliminate some of those biases. And the work is never going to be done. You know, I have spent, you know, a decade in my anti-racist work trying to eliminate as many of those internal biases as I can. And I think I've done a pretty decent job, but I'm not done. You know, I still say things that's like, oh God, that was quite the microaggression right there. Why am I still thinking like that? There's something else that I'm going to have to examine and try and exude or dig out of myself. So I think recognizing that dynamic of, you know, don't feel shame over having these biases, because it's not your fault that you do. It's the society that you were raised in. But you do still have them. And so you do have a responsibility to keep working on it, to always be trying to improve and get better.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it was one of my hardest learning curves at the beginning of my work, was that people were calling me out, and I was like, oh, fuck, like I've done it again, or people would bring up something that was just so over my head, it was so advanced, and I would have to like really take a deep breath and think about what they've said, and kind of get over the fact that somebody shouted at me on the internet or whatever. And I have to kind of get over that and just really look at the facts. What is it that what point are they raising? You know, and then also acknowledge that actually what you intended to say, when people are calling you out, what you intended to say carries very little weight, and it's more important to understand the actual impacts that your words are having. You know, and again, people are angry at you. They're not necessarily suggesting that you're the spawn of Satan, although if you are, like, I probably would be fine with that. but it, but you know, it's more that they're angry, they're pissed off because you have echoed something that's already plaguing them, and that actually it probably was a bit shit of you, but you just had no idea. And
That's right.
yeah, I think learning that was pretty hard, and your ego really does take a bit of a pummeling. But
I
once you get used
completely
to it,
agree.
I think. Sorry.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, the defensiveness of privilege that we come with, um, and kind of just the fragility of it, of, ooh, somebody called me racist, somebody called me transphobic. You shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm a good person. I didn't mean it like that. You're just being overly sensitive, et cetera. It's like anything to take away the focus on you, or something that would imply that you're a bad person.
Mm,
When, really, I mean, if somebody calls you out for doing something racist, somebody calls you out for being transphobic, it shows that that person cares, that that person is trying to help you. And I'm not even necessarily saying that they're always correct, but those are the moments where we need to step back and reflect on, okay, what was it that I said, and what type of an impact? I think you said the exact right words, that it's has nothing to do with the intent of what we meant, or what we did, what we were trying to do is irrelevant. What matters is the impact and the effect that it has on others. And understanding that dynamic and getting to that point where you can, take that breath, step away, think about it, engage in the discussion in it, without shit deleting your post right off the bat. That's part of growth.
mm.
And it's vital to get to that point.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to remember as well that it's messy, and you know, there are some bits, even with the best will in the world, you're going to still resist it, and
Yeah.
you're going to make an absolute fucking tit of yourself as well, and you're just going to have to live it down and just accept it and embrace it. And I do think, though, it makes you more flexible as a human being. And I've found as well that I'm more honest in my day-to-day life and my general interactions, that you know, if something's gone wrong, I'm like, oh, I've really fucked this up. Whereas the younger version of me would have been terrified to have even admitted that to myself, let alone somebody else. I would have been so anxious and trying to cover it up and trying to make sure nobody found out about something. I remember once, actually, I blocked a toilet at work like years ago. I had an upset stomach and I was like terrified of telling anyone. So I like got a penny and I like managed to lock the door from the outside so people just wouldn't go in there for like maybe the rest of the day. And then somebody found it, like they're like, did you do this? I was like, no, I didn't, but I was the only other person there who used that toilet. So they knew it was me. I was just mortified. But you know, now I would feel much less bad about that. It really wouldn't eat me like things would then. And I do think that there's like a certain liberation to being really painfully honest about things in a compassionate way. Um, it makes arguing with transphobes easier as well, I think. What do you think that there's a particular reason why social sciences get such a bad rep? Because surely they're up to the same kind of standards of scrutiny when you're getting to the sort of point in studies that you are, to anything else on the same level.
It's difficult. And, the debate about whether, social science, like sociology, is a real science, has been going on for a very long time. And part of the issue is that, unlike biology, what causes A, you can actually get to a definitive cause of X, or B, I guess it should be how I did it, A to B. A to X. That's much easier. It's like, you can get in the lab, get in a controlled setting, and you can isolate, variables and actually establish direct causal relationships. With sociology, where you're talking about societal forces within humanity, it's far more difficult because it's a far more complex type of situation. And you can't do the type of controlled experiments that a biologist could do, because that would be, you know, entirely unethical. You know, say, hey, I'm going to grab, you know, these type of people and I'm going to put them in one room, and I'm going to take other people and put them in the other room, and I'm going to subject these people to racism, and I'm going to subject these people to not, like, you can't do that. And so, you know, the conclusions that you're going to be able to draw from social science are always going to be far more nuanced. You know, there is no theory of gravity, you know, in sociology. You know, there are some basic social facts, to use an old term, you know, that we can definitely talk about. You know, I think it is very widely accepted at this point that intersectionality is a thing. That is a dynamic that shapes humans' lives. And typically, at least, the top three identity categories that are going to have the most impact on somebody's life is going to be their gender, their race, and their class. I don't think any of the three, broadly speaking, more important than the other. They each interlock in different types of ways. And yet you can't say, you know, one dynamic is going to be the same across all people, because that's going to shift depending on who the person is, and it's going to shift throughout their life. Sometimes class is going to be a far bigger issue for a person. Other times their race might be a bigger issue. Sometimes their gender is going to be different, or affect their lives in, you know, greater or lesser degrees. So I think part of sociologists' job is to not only describe those dynamics and how they influence people. And, you know, some of my colleagues would definitely disagree with me on this, but I'm going to follow the advice of W.E.B. Du Bois and others and say it is the job of social scientists to inform advocacy movements for what is actually going to improve the lives of marginalized people. I think that's actually a duty. It is not the completely objective, you know, neutral stance that hard sciences at least purport to have, although frequently I don't think they do. But yeah, I think that that's actually important to do. You know, I am trying through my work to improve the lives of trans people and non-binary people. That is what I am actually trying to do. And I don't think that is a negative on the work. I think that's actually a positive, because it's also not to the degree of, you know, we're still going to publish our methodologies, how we came to the conclusions that we did. Your work needs to be able to stand up to criticism and, you know, investigation and replication by others. But there's still a reason why I'm doing the work in the way that I'm doing.
Yeah, so you'd mentioned before, Rose, about only having come out in sort of recent years.
Yeah.
But were these kind of thoughts there already for you? Were you already interested in trans rights and intersectionality before you realized, or before you came out?
Yeah, you know, so I came out about my sexuality, you know, back in my teenage years, you know, and I had that whole super fun, you know, experience with it at that point, growing up in an incredibly conservative Mormon household. You know, I got put through conversion therapy. I ended up homeless for a while during high school. It was a lot to deal with, even back then. And then throughout my 20s, you know, I was working as a political journalist, but also very involved in kind of queer advocacy. And I very much fit that stereotype, you know, that we talk about within the trans community of, you know, I was a super ally. I care about trans and non-binary issues so much. Why? I don't know. Don't ask me. I just care. Don't, let's not talk about it any further. I was just not in the point in my life yet to start, you know, really questioning my own identity in that way. I think largely because I'd had such a traumatic experience with my sexuality.
What label had you used when you were younger about your sexuality?
About my sexuality, it varied. I was, you know, I'm very fluid. You know, when I first came out, I am old enough that, you know, when I came out, this was kind of pre-widespread internet access. It was pre-cell phones, or at least widespread, not all cell phones. I'm not that old. But pre-widespread cell phone access. I'm sorry, I forget who I'm talking to. Pre-mobiles.
Fine. We know what you mean.
So, you know, there wasn't really a community. I didn't have language, you know, for who I was. You know, I had barely understood what gay meant. You know, I think I was in middle school, probably. So probably somewhere around 14 or 15 when I realized that gay was anything other than, you know, a synonym of bad. Like I had no idea that it referred to something else. That was just not the society that I was raised in. So when I came out, I just said, "Oh, gay," and then it started shifting. You know, I was like, "Oh, okay." Actually, as the language developed, for me, it was like, "Oh, okay, maybe bi, maybe pan, no, maybe gay, no straight." I don't. Shut up! Don't ask me. You know, I like the definition of bisexual today that we use of just, hey, I'm attracted to 2 or more genders,
Yeah.
which is kind of just what it is for me.
Yeah, that's
probably
fine.
more info on that than you were looking for.
No, it's the same for me. Like I started out as saying bi, and then it became pansexual, and then I realized that actually I don't often fancy people or want to touch them. Like I'll marvel at them from afar, but then more than that, you know. And I remember when I was I think I was just about mid-20s, and I was with an ex-girlfriend, and I remember she was really checking out their estate agent who'd come over to like look at the flat to put it on the market to rent or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And this ex-girlfriend, she wasn't the model of female empowerment, but she was leaning over the balcony, sort of almost drooling after. It was very ungraceful, drooling after this estate agent who was a very lovely looking young lady. And I remember saying to her, I was like, I don't get what you're doing. I don't understand this reaction that you're having. And she was like, cool, well, she's just really fucking hot. And I was like, she was like, can't you see that? And I was like, yeah, I do. But it doesn't elicit anything within me. I just don't understand what this thing is. And so eventually I came to the whole demisexual thing. And then I realized, I was like, I've met a lot of people that I just think are lovely, but I don't fancy them. I don't kind of want to date them or anything. And then demi-romantic came in. So now when people ask me, I'm just like, just whatever. I can't. I'm like, really, it would be like pan, demi-romantic, demisexual, but that's just too much. So I just, yeah.
Isn't that a common dynamic? Like if you're talking with somebody, you know, outside the community, we tend to use very macro identity labels. You know, somebody asked me, you know, hey, what's your gender identity? It's like, trans and non-binary woman. What does that mean? Don't worry about it. It means what it means to me. That's all you need to know. I use she, her, and they, them. Stick with that. But, you know, if I'm talking to somebody inside of the community, particularly somebody within the non-binary community, well, then I'm going to start bringing up different micro labels. It's like, you know, what's your gender? Well, all right. Do you have 35 minutes? I could try and start describing this for you.
Yeah, it's only recently actually that I realised that I think there's a tiny bit of boy. I think if my gender was a cake, it's just a gender, and then like it's got a cherry on the top that's boy. And I know that because any time that I've said something dirty or rude or naughty or childish, someone goes, "Ugh, you're such a boy." I feel so happy in that moment. It's nothing more than that. It's just when I'm really being disgusting, and I just really I really enjoy that. But yeah. Anyway,
So can I ask you a question then?
yeah, go for it.
If do you identify, like, if somebody said, "Are you transgender?" Would you say yes or no?
Yes, I would say yes.
See, okay, so you would say yes, because I'm working on a project currently with one of my mentors, Dr. Guadalupe, who is looking at self-reported health statistics among trans and non-binary populations. And one of the issues that we're coming up with is in how the data was collected, is we're using the US Trans Survey, which is a national survey that's collected by an organization. And we're very excited to get access to that data because it's very rare to have nationwide data. But one of the issues that's presenting itself is the way the survey is done is it asks people, are you transgender? And if somebody says no, then the survey just assumes that they're cisgender and moves on.
Right.
But that's, and if you answered yes to yes, I'm transgender, then it's also going to ask, are you non-binary? And then you can narrow it down to other labels. But that creates a big problem because there are, as you know, there's a lot of people who are non-binary who don't use the transgender label at
Yeah.
all.
Mhm.
And may not even use the non-binary labels, may use just micro labels, that are technically under the non-binary umbrella, but somebody may not use that term. Maybe you only use agender or demigender.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it creates a complication when you're trying to do research, because even when you're trying to recognize the variation within the community, you can't exactly do a telephone survey asking all those questions. Are you trans? Yes or no? Are you non-binary? Yes or no? Are you this? Yes or no? This? Yes or no? Like, it just becomes incredibly bulky and difficult.
Yeah,
uh,
the way that I've got over that in a lot of my discussions is doing trans plus, just so that it's recognizing that maybe trans isn't your specific label, but there are other ones that where we're kind of talking about non-cis identities, right? But I
yeah.
think to say that I'm non-cis, it's saying that you have an absence of something rather than celebrating actually what your identity is.
Yeah. And
So
that's, for some people, that's how they do it. And that's perfectly valid and that's great.
yeah,
For other people, they don't like the plus or the asterisks.
yeah,
Um, people just don't like that. So, yeah, that's hopefully as I move forward, I'm hoping we can find alternatives to that, to how we start collecting that data. Maybe it could be something like that where you're just asking, like about just gender variance broadly. The best practice obviously is to have somebody just, how do you identify your gender, and let people fill in the blank.
right.
But that gets tricky when you're trying to do, a mass survey. You're trying to get thousands of responses. It's not easy, and it does present a challenge.
Mm. Yeah, it really does. And I find a lot of the time that when I'm trying to discuss subjects with people, I want it to be as simple as possible so they have somewhere, um, fairly accessible to start. But I also find that there are these moments where I'm thinking about, like, as you said, these conversations within our community that are so complex, and people using words, and sometimes a lot of words that I maybe have only read once and I have to Google it again because I'm getting older and my memory for details is really failing me now. And I have to go back and kind of Google things again. Um, but it doesn't put me off. I'm used to people having their very own individual relationships with these words.
Yeah.
But then the second you kind of get outside of that and people are like, what word do you use for you? I'm thinking, well, I've got a choice of about 4, but I'll just pick I'll just pick one, because I don't know. Yeah, it's so difficult and nebulous, but also I think really exciting. And I
Yeah.
sometimes wonder if this is kind of the very essence of not being cis, is that it literally takes a big old dump on this idea that you can categorize.
I'm
And
sensing a theme in the analogies that you use.
how dare you?
I mean, you're right though. Any marginalized community, one of the, most critical things for a marginalized community is going to be the process of self-identification.
Yeah.
Rather than having identities imposed on you by the dominant group. Dr. Susan Collins talks a lot about this within Black feminist thought, but it applies across marginalizations. Because the labels that get imposed on the community by the dominant groups are going to reflect their stereotypes of the group, are going to be labels that are going to reinforce the stratification or the hierarchy of that domination.
Yeah.
So allowing communities to have these discussions within themselves is crucial to starting to, move that community forward in its own self-defined type of way. But, often the people who lead these discussions, these, amazingly brilliant, intellectuals who are starting to build out a community's own theoretical framework are oftentimes not, qualifying under that kind of white cis capitalist knowledge structure of academia. We all know how gatekeeped university degrees are. They're incredibly difficult to attain for anybody who is not a cis white neurotypical wealthy man. That is who universities are designed for. And the further you get from that identity, the more marginalizations you bring in, the more difficult it becomes. But just because somebody doesn't have, an academic degree is not, allowed, they're actually prohibited from publishing, does not mean that the conversation and the theory that they produce for the community is not still vital to listen to. One of the most brilliant people that I know is a Black non-binary individual named Rhizome on Facebook. The conversations that they develop around gender, around race, and around ageism, and then also within a critical class analysis, are better than 80% of what I see coming from, official academics, who have all of the certifications. And yet you'll never see their work, published in any meaningful way, even though we learn from these people. So I think that's something that I'm trying to keep in mind and figure out how to do, because, citing someone like that in a way that is going to be accepted within scholarship is difficult. To say, hey, this person has really good thoughts, we need to be listening to them. It's like, well, who are they? Where did they get their doctorate from? It's like, well,
Yeah. I hate that. Sometimes I find myself, I avoid it as much as I can now because I'm already kind of medicating anxiety, but I do once in a while find myself in arguments with very unempathetic people on Facebook or in other places, and I'll often say something that to me is something that I have literally seen a million times. It's completely obvious, and it is an absolute fact without any shadow of a doubt. You know, it's like you know, it's like me saying, you know, a lot of toddlers will learn to walk around one, or like I have seen toddlers learn to walk. I've seen them do it themselves, and you know, I feel like I'm just saying the most basic kind of unquestionable thing, and yet people coming along going, what study did you get that from? And I just really want to throw my phone into a lake. I was going to say toilet, but I avoided it because I didn't want to I didn't want to follow the theme anymore. But no, I also imagined it would be a great catharsis for just a moment, throwing a phone into a lake, and then deep regret because I don't have another one. It's kind of essential to my life. But but yeah, I have these moments when I'm like, it's new information to you. That doesn't make it fucking rocket science, okay?
Yes.
Just because it's a big thing for your brain to handle, this to me is just a really basic another day. Like, and I'm like, where do we kind of sit? Because you know, for us who experience these things day in and day out, and it's completely mundane, and to somebody else it's like we're trying to tell them that unicorns exist and I have one in my back garden, and they're like, shut up, no you don't.
Yeah. We don't want to trust marginalized communities to understand their own issues, you know,
Yeah.
better than anybody else. You know, this is kind of a constant point of pushback that I get, especially, you know, when I'm doing like that training that I mentioned and I'm talking to faculty and I'm saying, look, your area of research may be gender, and yet still, I don't care how long you work on it, how much you've put into it. When you have that 18-year-old freshman walking into your door who is trans, they get it better than you do. And they will always get it better than you do. I don't care if you've put 40 years of work into this. You know, me as a trans and non-binary woman, I am always going to understand trans and non-binary issues better than any of my cis colleagues. And yet, the 18-year-old freshman who walks in my door, who is a trans person of color, gets that better than I ever will. Even though, I mean, I live and breathe this. I spend 24/7, you know, learning about this and pushing it and trying to do the research. And yet I will never be the authority on that intersection ever. It's just not possible. But that's important to recognize. It doesn't mean I can't still contribute to the field, because I think I have, you know, hopefully, hypothetically, I have a lot to add to that. We'll see if that turns out to be the case or not. But for some intersections, for people who have less privileges than I do in different areas, they still need to be the voices that are being uplifted and listened to the most.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that you've highlighted something really important, that we still, as a society, value an accreditation over somebody's lived and highly proficient experience. And I still, I think I mentioned to you earlier that I really recognize the work that people put into their academic achievements, but I still also really struggle with the fact that these institutions were born of privilege, elitism, white supremacy most of the time, and misogyny largely as well.
Yes.
And I was recently interviewing Ariel Shaw, who is a Black trans woman, and she was saying that she's just graduated learning gender studies in a building that was owned by a white racist and misogynist man. Like, it was named after him.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't, you know, it's just so ironic. It's so ironic. And when I started this kind of work, my dad said to me, well, you know, you should go and get a degree in this, and I don't have a degree at all because I didn't want one.
Sure.
And there was part of me that thought, even if I did go to learn, like, what would I actually go to learn? Because I could guarantee that I will learn more spending time with people day to day than I ever will going to sit in a classroom. And actually, I'm more concerned with the people that I'm helping day to day, with their own lives, their own work, family, children, all that kind of thing. And I don't really know that being in a classroom for however many years is going to help me get there any faster. And if anything, it may even slow me down for the type of work that I am doing and want to do. And
Yeah.
I think I still had a bit of shame and a bit of hang up about the fact that I'm one of those people on the ground implementing these things, rather than being the one who's diligently driving towards some answers. And I do think that it really does take such a massive network of all of us doing all of these different kind of roles in order to advance our inclusion and equality. But
Mhm.
and thinking
Mm.
about sort of moving forward. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, and even moving beyond, inclusion, because sometimes I even have issues with that word because it kind of rolls into that, white cishet notion of inclusivity that relies on a toxic positivity framework. Where you're talking about. When I hear the word, I think of university campuses just because that's kind of the area that I'm in at the moment. But you will see organizations that get set up by schools on campus, like that'll have inclusion in their center, access and diversity type deals. But what they're really trying to do is just say, see, we have marginalized people on campus. See, we have Black people, yay! We have trans people, yay! Um,
So just tokenism, really.
exactly. It's not actually shifting the dynamic of power to actually give marginalized people control, or a seat at the table in any meaningful way. I don't think the work that comes out of academia, my work that I'm trying to put forward, I don't think that's where leadership comes from. I don't think that's how the community moves forward. I think the contribution of like my work, for example, is hopefully to be able to inform the movement on the ground, to be able to arm and equip the movements on the ground to move forward, to recognize as much as we all hate it, we do live within that cis heteronormative capitalist framework, white framework. So if I can create something that framework accepts as valid or worthwhile, then I can use it to inform the movement on the ground or equip the movement on ground to continue tearing that structure down to the point where it's gone.
Yeah. I'm sure you and I in the past had sort of Facebook conversations about communism before.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still a fan of communism or the theory of it?
I am a Marxist-Leninist all the way.
Yeah.
Yes.
What does it for you in a nutshell? What do you look at and think that sounds a lot nicer than what we've got?
As far as like the end result of communism, I think a lot of people struggle with communism because it is so, what's the word I'm looking? It's so anti-utopian. Unlike other frameworks like anarchy or others that, have this kind of solid vision of, after the change over, whether it's a revolution or whatever it is, we eliminate capitalism. What is the world exactly going to look like? Marxism doesn't do that. Marxism is going to look at it and say, well, we are going to outline the principles of how to construct a post-capitalist society, but we can't actually define what it's going to look like because you can't predict what the material conditions on the ground are going to be. That's just not possible, and it's unrealistic to look at it that way. But we can create, those principles. They're going to outline how to develop a society in a way where every voice truly does matter in a true democratic sense, in a way that's never really been seen before. That appeals to me a lot. I think just the entire framework that sits around extracted value and exploitation. I mean, to me, when I read it, it seems plainly obvious that that is the way that the world works. So reversing that dynamic, I think, is something well worth pursuing.
So, I mean, obviously, from someone who has not read very much about a lot of these kind of political ideologies and stuff, what I've heard about communism is, I think about Russia and like vaguely one of my brain cells wants me to say something about South America, although I couldn't even really tell you anything. It might not even be relevant, but and a lot of these conversations come up about sort of dictators and sort of death tolls and stuff, because my brother is a keen historian and he's currently in his final year of doing an ancient history degree, and he's been schooled very differently. My sister and I, we did go to a good school, but it wasn't private or anything, it wasn't paid for. It was a state school, and then my brother got into a private school. So we've grown up in these very different spheres, very different spheres. And I think the way that he's talked about communism and sort of said other regimes that sort of claimed or tried to be communist, there were like death tolls and some really dodgy, horrible things happened, and there was a dictator and all this sort of thing. And I'm like, well, what do you say about that? Because I mean, obviously, you can take any ideology and like really screw it up.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, first of all, we have to recognize that there has never been a communist system that has actually been put into practice. A couple places have come closer than others, but like the USSR was never communist. Is there a state? Is there money? Okay, it's not communist. The USSR in particular kind of moved into a quasi-socialist state, but it never actually, completed the vision of sweeping away the last vestiges of capitalism and installing the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the intermediate step that's required before you can actually move into communism. And dictatorship in this context, that word tends to scare a lot of people. So, understand under, Marxist and Leninist theory, all states are dictatorships by definition. They just are. They are oppressive. So the dictatorship of the proletariat just means, right, but it's changing who has the power, where now the working class is going to have the power and as a transitory stage. Because that's kind of the issue with anarchism. If you actually had a successful revolution and you swept away the state, but then that was it, you're going to have millions dead on your hand. People who rely on government healthcare, people who rely on other social services are just going to be done. Marxism specifically puts in that intermediate step to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Right.
I will say that there is a lot of white Western propaganda about what happened in the USSR. I'm going to try to phrase this carefully, because I'm not actually going to defend like Stalin. I'm not a fan. However, a lot of the mythology around Stalin is entirely fictitious. You know, the death tolls that you hear contributed or attributed, pardon me, to Stalin almost always include World War II figures. And it's like, oh, right, a lot of people died in World War II, we're aware, but that's, wait, you're putting that at the USSR's feet? They didn't start World War II. You know, yes, a lot of people died in the war. You know, or you hear about, oh, all these people were sent to, you know, prisons in USSR. It's like, right, they had trials. And yes, a lot of capitalists were put in prison. The famines that you hear in the USSR didn't actually happen. All the photos that are from them are actually from a different time period and not even in Russia. Most of the propaganda that we hear about the USSR actually comes from one single source, this Western journalist who fabricated almost all of his data and eventually went on trial for it in the US and went to jail for lying about all of it. If you want to look a little bit closer to what communism would actually look like, I really think we need to look at Cuba, which is not a communist state. It's a socialist state, but have really done some amazing things. You know, and again, it's not to say perfect, because nothing is, but especially in the last few decades has started to do some amazing work. They redid, Cuba redid their constitution just a little while ago, and the process for how they did that was incredible, because they're the equivalent of like their General Assembly, you know, created the first draft of the Constitution, but then it goes down to all of their, I mean, I'm going to use kind of Western labels for this, but their caucuses, then it went down to other interest groups, and then down to the neighborhood level, where every individual citizen had an actual legitimate say over what went into the Constitution. Not, you know, kind of this, oh yeah, you have a say, you voted, you know, Western democracy. God, I have to like air quote all of this, you know, Western electoral system that had actual says in it. And then it filtered back up to the assembly. I mean, that's really cool.
Yeah.
You know, Cuba has doctors in every single neighborhood. I don't know stats for the UK, but like where I live, you know, we have on average one doctor for like every 200,000 people. Cuba, it's going to be, you have one doctor like per neighborhood. You have a social worker assigned per neighborhood. You have government officials with actual authority, not just, you know, to make people feel better, down on local levels, you know, to the point where Cuba is now one of the biggest exporters of doctors in the world. Their education system is one of the most amazing. When Cuba finds, you know, hey, there's an area of research that needs to be done, they start pumping more money into PhDs to say, hey, people, this is an area we need to start developing. So if anyone would like to do a PhD, here's all the funding to go do it. Here's all the funding for your projects, because we want to develop as a nation like this. It's really quite impressive.
Yeah, that sounds super cool. And I'm going to have to look into that more, because, you know, people ask me questions all the time. Well, if you didn't have this system, then what would you have? And, you know, it's kind of like, you know, the system we have right now might be kind of, you know, like a three-legged donkey or something, but it's still a three-legged donkey. It's better than no donkey. I'm like, but why does it have to be a donkey or a no donkey? Why can't it be like a field full of sheep? It could be totally different, but still really good.
Yeah. I mean, you know, you get that argument of like, oh, well, it works on paper, you know, but it can't work in practice. It's like, have you ever looked at capitalism? You know, have you ever looked at a system that was inherently built on racist exploitation and colonialism? Capitalism could not exist without that system continuing today. We just call it different things. You know, now we call it outsourcing, where, you know, you want to go buy a Hershey's candy bar that relies on child slave labor to process those cocoa beans. You know, how do you get everything so cheap? How do we benefit from that? I mean, hundreds of millions of people have been killed and continue to be killed under capitalism. People are still being exploited. People cannot ever have their potentials reached or the freedom to pursue what they want to pursue because they live under a wage labor system that strips them of their dignity and alienates them from their labor, from the process of labor, from each other, from ourselves. In other words, capitalism is great on paper, but it doesn't work in practice. You know, I think part of the thing that appeals to me about, oh, I can't claim that phrase. I stole that from somebody. I just can't remember who at the moment. You know, one of the things that appeals to me about communism is how individualistic it is. You know, once you are freed from a system where you have to work to survive, where your survival is no longer dependent on your labor, well, then you get to pursue what you want to pursue. Because, you know, I believe, you know, like Mark said, that human species essence is labor. We want to work on something, you know, whether that is somebody who really wants to be a doctor, somebody who really wants to be an artist, somebody who really wants to do, you know, I have a friend who does municipal planning, you know, designs roads and bridges and all that stuff, because that's what they love to do. So once you're freed from that constraint of, well, I have to do whatever the system forces me into, because if I don't, I'm not going to be able to eat. I'm not going to have a place to live. Well, then you can go do what you want. You want to go be a doctor? Go be a doctor. You want to just open a cafe? Go open a cafe. Do it. Pursue what is going to individually fulfill your life and operate in a communal sense for the betterment of everybody. I mean, who doesn't find that appealing?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I like that. Thank you for that. So with moving forward, obviously, we've got to think about the next generations. And I know that you're doing complete, like, gender neutral parenting with your little one, but your little one is older than the number of years that you've been out. So you must have decided to go the whole hog with a gender neutral parenting before you came out. And you know, how was your ex, your co-parent, how was she about the whole thing, and did you have to convince her, or was she really on board with it, or how did that come about?
Oh, totally on board. Yeah. You know, kind of falls back into that super ally moment.
Yeah.
You know, I had friends who were non-binary. I was at least familiar with the issues and the struggles that come from forcing a gender identity onto an infant. Because I mean, we do, you know, like the very first thing that happens to a child is they get gendered. You know, whether it's through a sonogram and then, you know, gender reveal parties, which I think are violent and horrific, to, you know, the moment a child is born, they instantly get, you know, a pink hat or a blue hat put on and start being forced into those gendered expectations and gender norms. I mean, that the concept of that is horrific to me. You know, this idea that you would force a child into that from the moment of their birth. And there are a lot of studies that back this up, of the consequences of those expectations that we put on kids from the moment of birth, right down to how infants are treated by their parents based on their assumed gender. You know, there's been several studies that actually show that babies that are assumed to be girls get more eye contact. They are allowed to cry more. I've always felt it's disgusting. Yeah. So yeah, my ex and I, my co-parent, we felt that that was not appropriate to do to our child. That Finley, who is now almost 5, that they are going to get put into a lot of boxes, in life. It's the society that we currently live in. We weren't going to be the first to do it. So we have used, gender, we used they and them, not in the sense that we were assigning pronouns to them, but just as we were trying to remain neutral with it. Nobody knows the sex that they were assigned at birth, even though sex is entirely a social construct as well and doesn't actually exist in nature, but that's a different that's a different one. And, we tried to stay very neutral with clothing options at the beginning. And then as Finley got older, we followed their lead on what do they want to wear, how do they want to be addressed. It's actually so cool to watch because even at like 2.5, Finley understood gender better than probably 90% of the people on the planet. They don't assume other people's gender. They follow the rules of we use they and them for everybody until they tell us their pronouns, because how could we possibly know? We can't. Finley has been very forceful from the beginning of, nope, these are my pronouns today. This is my gender today. And I expect people to respect it. They were 2.5 in the supermarket, and they'd have somebody, walk up because they have long blonde hair because they don't like haircuts. They would have people walk up and see their hair and just, equate, oh, long hair equals girl. Therefore, what a cute little girl. And Finley would just, no, today I'm a boy and I use he, him. Other days, it's, nope, I'm non-binary. Yesterday, they were agender and insisted on no pronouns. It's actually really amazing. Like, there's nothing in the world that makes me happier than watching my kid play with gender to what suits them. They have days where they will wake up and they want to wear, some of their really mask clothing. I want some brown jeans and this green, like, field shirt button up thing. And then they have other days where they want to wear a pink unicorn dress. So, it takes a lot of work to work with the people around them. I ended up designing all these trainings for their, like for their preschool, for all their teachers. I actually convinced the school to go through a training with me to work on it. So yeah, we'll see. Finley is still very fluid today. They have had a couple friends who were also raised neutral from birth. There's a lot of terms for it, gender creative, all sorts of things. And some of their friends have now very solidly fallen into a binary gender and have kind of solidified in that at this point, which, great. That's awesome. Their parents were thrilled for them. Finley hasn't. Finley is as fluid as ever now, and great. The point with me, I don't care what my child's gender is. I care that they pick it or they discover it for themselves.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll end up identifying, with the gender that, we stereotypically associate with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll stay fluid. I don't know. But as long as they're the ones who come to that conclusion, then I'm happy about it.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's lovely. All right, thank you so much for coming on, Rose. It's been fascinating. I could honestly talk to you for ages. I reckon maybe we'll have to get you back on when you're a bit further down in your PhD. We'll quiz you a bit then, see what you're working on and how it's going.
That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. Rose, if people want to come and find you on social media, is there anything that you would want them to follow you on? Or I know you did some comics at some point, didn't you?
Oh, at one point, but I deactivated a lot of those. That's
Oh,
I am not especially artistically skilled. It was just kind of a release for that moment. Um, I tweet a lot about the work and how other people, not only what I'm doing, but what others are doing, both in the movement as well as academically. So if people would like to find me on Twitter, I'm at Mountain Rosebud, which I think is adorable, but
no.
Uh, so yeah, feel free to find me there.
Cool. Lovely. Thank you so much, Rose.
Thank you, Harris.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Transection podcast, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. If you want to speak to us, you can tweet us at TransectionP. You can contact us on Instagram at Transection Podcast, or find us on Facebook at the Transection Podcast. Until next time.